Punishment in ancient Rome wasn't just about keeping order. It was about sending a message, public, painful, designed to stick in your mind. So what exactly did they do to lawbreakers? Let's just say, you won't forget it either. You see, capital punishment in ancient Rome wasn't just brutal, it was deeply symbolic. Today, crimes like desertion or adultery might lead to jail time or scandal. In Rome, they could lead to execution. No appeals, no mercy. And among all the grisly methods, one stands out. Chilling, theatrical, almost surreal. Poena culi, the punishment of the sack. This bizarre and terrifying ritual was reserved for one of the most shocking crimes in Roman society, parricide, the elimination of a parent or close family member. Why such theatrics for this crime? Well, the Romans believed that taking the life of the one who gave you life was an offense not just against the law, but against nature itself. So, what did poena culi entail? First, the convicted parricide would have his face covered with a wolf's skin, an act that marked him as a beast, no longer worthy of human recognition. Sandals were strapped to his feet, not for comfort, but to make sure he didn't pollute the ground with his footsteps. Then came the truly terrifying part. He was sewn alive into a leather sack, but he wouldn't be alone. Inside that sack joined a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. Each animal symbolized a twisted aspect of his crime: betrayal, madness, danger, and chaos. The sack, filled with living, squirming judgment, was then thrown into a river or the sea. No burial, no return to the earth, no breath of fresh air. As Cicero once put it, the punishment stripped the parricide of everything that makes life livable: the sky, the sun, the sea, the soil. It was a total erasure from the natural order, a soul cut off from humanity and the elements alike. But if you thought that was tragic, can you imagine standing in the center of a roaring arena, thousands of eyes locked on you, but no weapon in your hand, just the knowledge that in moments, something with claws and fangs is coming straight at you? This wasn't a nightmare. This was damnatio ad bestias, one of the Roman Empire's most brutal public executions. This horrifying punishment didn't just end lives, it turned death into a spectacle. Introduced around the 2nd century BC, it quickly became a favorite feature of Roman entertainment, especially for the lower classes. Picture it: a criminal, runaway slave, tied to a stake or handed a wooden sword, trembling as the gates creaked open and a lion or leopard stepped into the light. Can you imagine the terror? Would you have watched or turned away? Unlike trained bestiarii, fighters who faced wild beasts with real weapons and some hope of survival, those sentenced to damnatio ad bestias were meant to die. It was punishment wrapped in performance, law turned into blood sport. And in Rome's grand opening of the Colosseum in AD 80, it was part of the main event. But where did this barbaric practice come from? Was it always just about punishment? Some historians believe that in its earliest forms, damnatio ad bestias may have been more ritual than justice, possibly tied to religious sacrifice in regions like Africa and Asia, where lions were sacred. There's even a legendary account from Alexander the Great's campaigns where a man named Lysimachus defended another condemned soul, only to be thrown to a lion himself. And what did he do? He supposedly unalived the lion with his bare hands and earned Alexander's admiration. But not everyone was so lucky. In Carthage, Hamilcar Barca, a Carthaginian general, used this punishment during the mercenary war. His son Hannibal made it even crueler, forcing Roman captives to fight each other and then pushing the survivors to face elephants. And while Rome officially banned human sacrifice centuries earlier, damnatio ad bestias continued, not as religion, but as pure, deadly theatre. Lions were rare and expensive, but Romans imported not only them, bears, panthers, even Caspian tigers, to fuel the crowd's lust. The screams, the growls, the final silence. Damnatio ad bestias was finally abolished in AD 681, but its shadow lived on. Even in the Byzantine Empire, nearly 400 years later, it made a chilling encore when a royal eunuch was thrown to lions for conspiracy. But you see, in ancient Rome, punishment wasn't always grand or bloody. Sometimes it was slow, humiliating, and meant to crush your spirit before your body. For minor offences like neglecting duties or causing a little trouble, the go-to punishments were much more personal. But before we dive into the details, make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying our content. Okay, now picture this. A rod made from elm, the same kind of tree you might pass by on a calm afternoon walk, now turned into a tool of punishment, much like the birch switches of Old England or hickory sticks in early America. It was designed to sting, bruise, and deliver a fast, painful lesson. If that didn't do the job, there was a harsher option: the scuttaker or lorum, leather whips, sometimes braided or knotted like a cat o' nine tails, built to cut deeper and leave lasting marks. Painful? Certainly. Effective? Rome seemed to think so. But what if pain wasn't the point? Some punishments focused entirely on public shame. One of the cruelest involved immobilizing the offender in a stock-like device where even brushing away a fly was impossible. Sounds small, until you imagine being stuck there, helpless and ridiculed. Even worse was the furka. Ever heard of it? The name became so infamous it turned into an insult: furcifer. This punishment forced the offender to carry a heavy, forked wooden beam on his shoulders, arms stretched and bound, as he paraded in full view of his peers. Add a lashing while you walk, and you've got a spectacle no one wanted to repeat. For slaves in particular, the consequences ran deeper. If the rod didn't break you, you might be sent to a fate far worse than pain, which was hard labor. A pampered city slave who misbehaved too often could be banished to the countryside. And if you think that sounds like a peaceful escape, think again. The countryside meant exhausting days at the mill or grueling labor in stone quarries. Rome's version of hell. Heavy shackles, little rest, and constant beatings turned these places into punishment machines. And if you still didn't learn your lesson, you might be sold off to become a gladiator. Yes, the kind that fought till they took their last breath for the crowd's amusement. But who carried out these punishments? Interestingly, it wasn't always the master. Sometimes a fellow slave, temporarily dubbed the Carnifex or Lararius, was ordered to do the dirty work. Imagine the tension that was created. Would you trust your fellow slave again? Would he trust you if the roles were reversed? And for executions? That job went to the servi publici, public slaves tasked with carrying out death sentences outside the city walls, far from the eyes of the elite, but not forgotten. But there were other brutal methods in punishing slaves who offended. It was slow, agonizing, filled with humiliation, and a different way to die. One of the most terrifying methods involved a scourge known as the flagrum or flagellum. Unlike ordinary lashes, this weapon was cruelly designed with bits of bone or metal attached to its thongs, meant to tear at the flesh. The pain was so intense that many victims didn't survive its blows. But that wasn't enough. To make the victim incapable of resisting, he was sometimes suspended from a beam, with weights attached to his feet. The idea was simple. You couldn't even writhe under the agony. It was an effective tool to break a person's will, ensuring they could never escape the memory of their punishment. Ever wonder what it might have been like to witness this? In Roman comedies, slaves often joked about these brutal punishments, teasing each other about the beatings they'd received or feared. But were these jests as light-hearted as they seemed? Or did they mask the deep terror and resentment that simmered beneath the surface? But the most extreme form of punishment, it was crucifixion. Can you even think of it, being sentenced to the slow, agonizing death of crucifixion? A punishment so horrific that it was reserved for slaves or non-citizens. If you tried to take your master's life, or if you were part of an insurrection, your fate was sealed. The punishment was meant to terrorize the population, making sure that no one would dare challenge the authority of Rome. The sight of a naked, dying body on a cross sent a message far beyond that individual's fate. If you committed the ultimate crime, your family might also suffer. The punishment didn't end with the criminal. Sometimes, the entire household would be crucified, a terrifying reminder of Rome's iron fist. In some cases, the punishment was extended to all slaves in the household, and sometimes, if the culprit wasn't found, hundreds of slaves were executed in their place. Does that strike you as a system of justice or terror? The word crux became synonymous with the ultimate curse, a term used among slaves to express fear and disgust. Imagine the horror of hearing that word and knowing that the same fate could await you. Then there were the Roman officers too, who had their own share of punishments when they flawed rules. Roman discipline was brutal, even within the ranks. You see, in the Roman military, discipline was everything, and the consequences of misbehavior were severe. The tribunes, who were high-ranking officers, had sweeping authority over the soldiers, including the power to impose fines, demand sureties, and even deliver corporal punishment. Alongside them, prefects had similar control over the allied troops. But what happened if a soldier stepped out of line? Well, the punishment could be harsh. For minor offenses like stealing, spreading false testimony, or neglecting their duties, soldiers were punished with a bastinado, a brutal beating with sticks and stones by an entire legion which awaited those who let the discipline slip. And if a soldier survived, there was no escaping the social shame. No one would take them in, and they'd be marked forever. But what about more serious crimes? The stakes were actually much higher for more serious offences. Imagine a soldier who was caught trying to falsely claim a heroic act for the sake of a reward. What do you think would happen in a modern army if someone made such a claim? The Romans didn't just tolerate deception, they punished it harshly. False reports of bravery were viewed as an attack on the integrity of the entire military system and could ruin the reputation of an entire legion. Then there was cowardice. The Romans placed enormous value on courage in battle, and a soldier who abandoned his post, threw away his arms, or showed fear in the heat of combat was seen as committing one of the greatest crimes against the legion. But the Romans were not quick to punish all deserters with death, at least not at first. Instead, when a group of soldiers broke ranks and fled in fear, the tribune would assemble the entire legion and publicly humiliate the offenders. The tribune would draw lots, randomly selecting a handful of soldiers to face punishment. This could be anywhere from 5 to 20 men, depending on the size of the group. The selected few would be subjected to the bastinado, a brutal flogging. Meanwhile, the others would face the shame of being fed barley instead of the normal wheat ration, a clear symbol of their disgrace. To make matters worse, they would be forced to sleep outside the protection of the camp's walls, exposed to the enemy's taunts and insults. But what was the purpose of this punishment? The fear of being selected for the bastinado or facing public shame worked as an effective deterrent. Soldiers knew that the lottery could land on them, no matter how brave they were. This fear kept them in line, forcing them to face even the greatest odds without retreating. Think about the psychological impact this would have on a soldier. If the enemy outnumbered them, it might seem like the best option to flee. But the dread of punishment, be it physical pain or public humiliation, made many soldiers choose to stay and fight, even when the odds were overwhelmingly against them. The most terrifying aspect of this system was its unpredictability. No soldier knew if he would be one of the ones selected for punishment, and this uncertainty made every man walk the fine line between obedience and disgrace. This system also made a statement about Roman military life. It wasn't just about the fear of death in battle, but the fear of the punishment that awaited those who didn't live up to their duty. In the long run, this system of punishment helped maintain the discipline and effectiveness of the Roman legions. But what do you think? Was this kind of fear-based system effective, or did it simply foster anxiety among soldiers, pushing them to fight out of fear rather than loyalty? Could such a system work in today's military forces, or would it be seen as too brutal and counterproductive? It's fascinating to consider how different the Roman approach to military discipline was compared to modern methods. Would soldiers today respond better to a system of fear and public punishment? Or would it break morale and trust among the ranks? But you see, under Roman rule, Christians were severely persecuted, often suffering discrimination, violence, and eliminations at the hands of the authorities. Roman society was built around a complex system of gods and the emperor's divine status. As a result, anyone who refused to adhere to this religious framework was seen as a threat to the social order. Christians rejected Roman gods, and they refused to worship the emperor, which led to accusations of hatred of the human race, a charge leveled by the Roman historian Tacitus. But what was life like for these early Christians? In many cases, they were systematically excluded from society. They were denied business opportunities, were targeted by mobs, and faced severe restrictions on their ability to worship. The Romans were particularly keen on stamping out Christianity because it undermined the traditional religious practices that held Roman society together. One of the most extreme forms of punishment was to publicly execute Christians, making them a spectacle for the masses. Tacitus describes some of the horrifying methods used against them. Some were crucified, others sewn into the skins of wild animals and thrown into the arena to be attacked by dogs, while some were even used as living torches to light the streets at night. It's a chilling image, isn't it? These brutal executions were meant not just to punish the individuals, but to send a strong message to anyone thinking of following their faith. But the persecution didn't stop there. Christians were often forced into hard labor, sometimes sent to work in the brutal Roman mines, where many would die from exhaustion and mistreatment. For others, the ultimate test came when they were arrested and offered a simple choice: recant their beliefs and live, or hold fast to their faith and face execution. Many chose death rather than renounce their beliefs, solidifying the resolve and determination of the early Christian community. Perhaps one of the most unusual aspects of early Christian life was their practice of secret meetings. Christians, often fearing for their lives, met in private homes, usually the homes of wealthy patrons, holding their services in the dead of night. This secrecy only heightened suspicion among the Roman populace. Christians who practiced communal rituals like the Eucharist, which involved the consumption of bread and wine symbolizing the body and blood of Christ, were falsely accused of cannibalism. Additionally, their secret meetings led to rumors of orgies and illicit behavior, none of which were true, but were a result of misunderstandings about their religious practices. The core of the Roman problem with Christianity lay in the refusal of Christians to participate in the worship of the Roman gods and the emperor. While the Romans were generally tolerant of foreign religions, they expected all subjects to pay homage to the Roman gods and emperor. This was seen as an essential part of being a loyal Roman citizen. Judaism and Christianity were different, though. They were monotheistic faiths, and for Christians, worshipping Roman gods or the emperor was simply not an option. Interestingly, Christianity wasn't the only religion facing resistance from the Roman state. There were many other belief systems, like Mithraism, Gnosticism, and Manichaeism, all competing for followers in the Roman Empire. But none of these posed the same challenge to Roman authority as Christianity. Why? Because unlike other groups, Christianity was actively exclusive in its worship, refusing to acknowledge the Roman gods, and that refusal was seen as both a political and social threat. In December 2023, archaeologists made a chilling discovery in Pompeii. A long-forgotten bakery where enslaved individuals and donkeys were tragically forced to work together in a grinding operation. This ancient bakery, hidden in the heart of the city, sheds new light on the brutal reality of servitude in ancient Rome. The bakery was found in a narrow, dark room with no external windows, only small, barred openings near the ceiling that allowed minimal light to filter through. This dungeon-like structure wasn't just a bakery, it was a prison. The space was designed specifically to trap its inhabitants, basically enslaved individuals and donkeys, depriving them of any meaningful freedom. Archaeologists noted that there were indentations in the stone floor, likely carved to prevent the donkeys from slipping as they were forced to walk in circles to power a millstone, grinding grain for bread. But what's even more chilling is the theory that the donkeys were blindfolded during their labor, ensuring they could only move in a repetitive, clockwise motion. This discovery offers a haunting glimpse into the darker side of Roman slavery and punishment, a world stripped of trust, stripped of humanity. In this space, the enslaved labored like beasts of burden, side by side with animals, their existence reduced to endurance. The room had no external door, only an inner one opening into a courtyard, a quiet, cruel detail that speaks volumes. There was no way out, no light, No dignity, just isolation, labor, and silence. But while the enslaved suffered in the shadows, Roman justice played out in full view, and it wasn't always as dramatic as lions or crucifixion. In fact, most Roman punishments were surprisingly bureaucratic. Fines were common. Theft, for instance, could result in repayment of up to 4 times the stolen item's value. But what about crimes that weren't just illegal, but sacrilegious, breaking a sacred vow, violating divine trust, that could lead to a fate even more terrifying? The offender might be declared homo sacer, the man set apart. It sounds cryptic, even poetic, but the reality was chilling. This person wasn't granted the dignity of trial or sacrifice. They could be killed by anyone, at any time, and the killer would face no punishment. Legally erased, socially untouchable, spiritually abandoned. Alive, but outside the protections of humanity itself. And yet, even in this brutal legal landscape, there were loopholes. Not all sentences had to be served. If someone was accused of a capital crime, there was still time to escape. Before the final vote was cast, the accused could choose voluntary exile, a legal exit strategy. Many fled to Athens, Rhodes, or Asia Minor, disappearing into the fringes of the Mediterranean world. On paper, it seemed like a victory, freedom instead of death. But exile came with its own price. Could someone raised in the noise, ambition, and chaos of Rome ever truly adjust to the quiet, unfamiliar streets of a distant city? Was survival enough, if it meant being forgotten? The Romans certainly had a well-established system of punishments, tailored to the severity of the crime and meant to uphold the stability and order of their society. Punishments were designed not just to penalize, but to deter others from committing the same offenses. It's interesting, though, that from today's perspective, some of these punishments can seem harsh or even unjust, like the persecution of Christians, for example. But for the Romans, it was all about maintaining control and ensuring that society functioned smoothly, even if it meant making extreme examples of those who defied the rules. What do you think? Were these punishments effective in maintaining order, or did they just fuel resentment and rebellion?